welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. This is a part 2. It's a follow-up to the previous episode, as I continue to wrestle with the question about whether we are conscious or whether we are consciousness. In other words, is there a me other than my consciousness and awareness, a me that has consciousness, or is what I think of as me just consciousness itself? Is there an I that exists or not? So in the last episode, I suggested that the ways that physics, philosophy, and different religions answer that question creates a kind of continental divide, like the spine of the Rocky Mountains in the United States, from which rivers flow either to the west or to the east. And so, too, there are two schools of thought within philosophy and interpretations of physics and religious heritages, which answer one way or the other. I shouldn't say two schools of thought, but two broad approaches to this question relative to whether we are conscious or whether we are consciousness itself. In the last episode, which is now part 1 of this topic, I looked at the side of the divide that says we're consciousness. So in this episode, I'll look at the other side of the divide. We are conscious. And as I often do, I'm going to begin first with how I might try to express some of this through art, in this case, a song. I wrote the song as I thought about my connections with my daughters in particular, imagining a time when I look back at our relationships from the future, even from a point in the future where I'm no longer part of their life. And it's a song called Someday.
Barely found this song to sing you. You already know what it's like to be living on the other side of me. And I'll be like a whisper in your soul, and you'll be all the parts that make me whole. I hope that I'll be whole someday. Whirlpools and camp out nights, High Sierra firelight, Pittsburgh, Asia, Oildale. There's still more chapters to this tale, and I'll be like a whisper in your soul, and you'll be all the parts that make me whole. I hope that I'll be whole someday. You're the ones who know me best, so I'll leave you here to fill in the rest. I know when I find it hard to stand, you'll be the one standing there holding my hand. And I'll be like a whisper in your soul, and you'll be all the parts that make me whole. I hope that I'll be home someday. Open all the doors inside to what we didn't know. like a whisper in your soul. And you'll be all the parts that make me whole. I hope that I'll be whole someday. Life's a million memories, from the grave back to our mother's knees. But memory's just another way of seeing all the things that we're still being. I'll be like a whisper in your soul, and you'll be all the parts that make me whole. I hope we'll all be home someday. Someday. Someday.
The song is clearly coming from the side of the divide that assumes consciousness is something I have, and that there's an I that has it, and other people that have an I as well. Whether in fact that's the case is something we're still considering. From art, then, I'm going to come back to physics, philosophy, and then religion. So first, physics and that other side of the divide, we are conscious. I don't know of any theory among physicists that definitely separates the self from consciousness and posits that we, quote unquote, are something that has consciousness in the way I'm framing it. The closest thing to such a theory, or a theory that might open itself to this, might be something proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, who suggest that consciousness emerges from quantum computations and vibrations occurring within microtubules or cellular structures within brain neurons, not just the neurons themselves, but something other than that. The theory leaves room for something other that might be the source of such vibrations, for example. However, it focuses on the physical basis of consciousness, and so it really doesn't address whether there's something in us separate from consciousness. Now, Penrose does in other situations or settings, but not in what I'm referring to here. As we noted in prior episodes, the theory called panpsychism suggests that consciousness might be a fundamental aspect of the entire universe. But again, the theory doesn't really address the question I'm asking here, whether this me I think is experiencing consciousness as me is anything other than the consciousness I'm experiencing. That doesn't mean different physicists don't have that opinion or way of thinking, but the physics itself doesn't seem to clearly indicate an answer to our question. So again, where physicists land as to our question about whether there is a self that has consciousness or not, and they land on both sides, given that they assess the same evidence, I contend that, and I brought this up in the last episode, that they come to their conclusions about what the science tells them based on something other than the science itself, like philosophy or religion, for example. So I'll turn there now. Philosophy and the other side of the divide, we are conscious. I'm going to focus here on Western philosophy because in the West we can rather easily separate religious and philosophical theories, or at least we think we can. Not that they don't affect and influence each other, they do. But the linkages in Eastern thought between what I'm calling philosophy and religion are far more closely entwined, and intentionally so. In my view, they're inextricable, in fact. Thus, Eastern views of consciousness don't require that I make a distinction between philosophy and religion. So, the Western philosophical view that the self is distinct from consciousness involves two core ideas as far as I can trace it. The first is what is called the mind-body dualism, which posits that there's a self or an I that is a non-physical entity. And this differs obviously from some theories within physics. The second idea is that there is a self, which is the subject that experiences consciousness. A self that is the I that's aware of having thoughts and feelings and sensations, and which experiences being conscious. The self is non-physical and is something which can experience being conscious rather than being defined by it. That's a summary of those two sort of core ideas. While philosophy has advanced beyond the thinkers that I'm going to briefly introduce here, in my way of understanding, as I look back at the sort of history of philosophy on this topic, the ones that I'm going to introduce provide sort of the fountainhead for the philosophical frameworks which continue to see the self as something distinct in some way from consciousness. And so I'm going to use them as kind of the examples or the exemplars even of this way of thinking within philosophy. And the two foundational figures in this regard are René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. Descartes, who's famous for the statement, "I think, therefore I am," highlighted not only the distinction of mind and body, but also emphasized the primacy of the thinking self over the physical body, and actually the thinking self within the rest of however we might understand the self. And that's a bias which has affected Western thought ever since. The bias being not only the primacy of mind over body, but of the thinking self over other psychological functions and faculties. But notice, too, Descartes is subtly referencing an I that thinks and an I which is. In fact, Descartes' entire philosophical project is rooted in his reflection on the act of thinking as a self that thinks. It's an extended process of self-reflection, standing apart from himself and thinking about what his self is doing. And in this, he has similarities with the Buddha, though Buddha's reflections caused him to assert a far more skeptical view of the accuracy of human reason than did Descartes. Immanuel Kant took up this question of self and subject and consciousness more explicitly in his philosophical work. He referred to the I think of Descartes as what accompanies all our thoughts, uniting them into a unified self-consciousness, enabling us to have experience of any sort in the first place. And he referred to this as the transcendental apperception, kind of a big word, very difficult to translate. He saw it as the basis for the awareness of ourselves as a thinking subject. Frankly, Kant is what I would term a thick thinker, difficult really to fully grasp or explain. But he is in many ways the fountainhead for subsequent philosophical streams that, in a wide variety of ways, hold some sort of view that consciousness is not what we are, but is something we have or experience. The I think for Kant, or the I that thinks might be better, is not an object of experience, but the condition that makes experience possible. So there's a subtle difference there with he and Descartes. Now, again, I'm just using two philosophers as examples, and I grant it's a thin presentation as a result, and that there's significant developments since these foundational thinkers. However, as far as I understand philosophical conversation on this topic, all the later philosophical approaches which land on the distinction between the self and consciousness are like rivers whose waters seem to flow from this fountainhead that these two provide. Well, then what of religions? So I turn now to religions and the other side of the divide. We are conscious. In the last episode, I described the way in which I see Buddhism as unique among the religions in defining the self as consciousness, not as something that has consciousness, and thus belonging on that side of the divide I covered in that episode. And I'm still wrestling, actually, with whether Buddha belongs there or not. In this episode, though, my aim is to summarize what the other religious heritages add to the discussion, and I'll actually come back to the Buddha at the end of that conversation. So let me briefly touch on animism as a religious heritage, which is the view that all the natural world is animated, souled, if you will, in some way, that includes, of course, human beings. Now, I've not discovered any descriptions among animists that indicate how they view the relationship between an I and consciousness. But when I consider the importance of dream states, for example, in animistic accounts, the reports of visitations and conversations with the departed, it seems to me that animism best fits and kind of assumes this view that human nature that says there is something to us that has consciousness as one of its attributes. There's a self that has those experiences, even beyond death. I'll turn now to the Gita. According to the Gita, the world as we know and experience it, i.e. what it calls prakriti, the material world of nature, is unconscious matter. It's uncaused. It has no beginning. It will not end. We experience it through our 6 senses. 5 of those we're very familiar with: sight and hearing and taste and smell and touch. But the 6th sense, the mind, is seen as one of the senses because it's how we engage with the world. But this implies that there's a we, or a me, that is engaging with that material world. One of the major themes of the Gita is that we normally think, what we normally think of as us, what we normally experience as ourselves being conscious, is actually enmeshed in the material world, prakriti, and isn't actually the true self. But there is an eternal, unchanging consciousness. One way to describe its relationship with prakriti, matter, is to say that prakriti is an external expression of eternal energy, of that self, that big S self. So the true subject, or I, according to the Gita, is also our true self and subject. And through the process of enlightenment and transformation taught by Krishna in the Gita, we can actually come to know that true self. Our small s self and small a atman can come to know the true nature of ourselves as large S self and large A atman. And that's why I've placed the Gita's view of human consciousness on the side of the continental divide that says that the human self has consciousness. It's conscious. The human self is not quite equal to the Buddha's view of consciousness itself. So in the Gita, that human self is not simply or merely the self that we think it is, however, or normally experience. And here, the Gita very much aligns with the Buddha. But at the end of the day, the I that is speaking in the Gita, Krishna, is an I that pervades everything in the cosmos and in every other I. It's in every other I is inherent or enmeshed in that I as well. And that's where we ultimately find our true I. The I which we might say possesses consciousness isn't defined by it. And that I is not merely the I which I think of as myself. So let me turn now to Judaism. In the opening book of the Jewish scriptures, specifically Genesis 2, we're told that God breathed breath from God's own mouth into the physical body of the first human, thus rendering humanity a living being. This is the origin of the self or the soul. We noted in prior episodes that in some expressions of Jewish thought, every object possesses some level of animation or souledness. Every blade of grass and grain of sand has a soul in some way, but the human soul is the most complex. In fact, in some streams of Judaism, there are 5 names or 5 dimensions of the soul. Nefesh, which is breath, the soul as the engine of physical life. Ruach, or wind, spirit, the emotional self and personality. Neshama, literally another word for breath, but used differently, the intellectual self. And Chaya, or life, the supra-rational self, the seat of will, desire, commitment, and faith. And then Yechida, which is singularity or oneness, unity. And this is the essence of the soul. It's unity with its source, which is ultimately the singular essence of the divine one. Now, the essence of the soul of a human being, then, is united in some way with the divine being. If I were to use the Gita's language, the small s self and soul of human beings is united with the large s self, God. Not, as in the Gita, ultimately the same as the large s self, although that's debatable even within the Gita, but united. A singularity in the term is the term used in some Jewish thought. Let me turn now to Christianity. The Christian scriptures, which include the Jewish scriptures, don't specifically address the question of consciousness overtly. We have to extrapolate from what the texts do say explicitly about the nature of human beings. So, for example, in a letter written by Paul to Jesus followers in the city of Thessalonica, there's an expression that's become a sort of blueprint in Christian thinking for understanding the nature of human beings. In the 5th chapter of that letter, the 23rd verse, Paul wrote, "May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept sound and blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." That verse expresses the classic formulation of the Christian view, that human beings are body, soul, and spirit. For now, I'm going to leave aside what makes the spirit different from the soul, and which of those two elements of our human nature is associated with consciousness. What's clear is that from a Christian perspective, human consciousness is distinct from the physical body. So let's start there, and the whole mind-body dualism thing is very much present here. However, distinct does not mean separate, and this is important, I think, to bring out with Christian thinking, and we'll see where it might apply to others. I say this because the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body, which is a complicated area. On the one hand, Christians generally believe that the human soul and mind, by extension also consciousness, is not merely a product of the brain, and so it's not dependent on the brain for its existence. It's a distinct entity that can continue to exist beyond physical death. But on the other hand, the belief in the resurrection of the body seems to suggest some sort of essential entangled connection between consciousness and our physical existence. Otherwise, why the reconnection of the soul with the body in the resurrection? One element of the continued existence of humans beyond death as embodied souls is that the resurrection body is both the same and yet also different than the bodies we have prior to death. So, for example, in Christian scriptures, we're told that after his resurrection, Jesus was recognizable by his wounds, though not always so. And yet his body also had the power, evidently, to move through walls, so same and different. The Jewish view that there is a resurrection is similar in a number of respects to the Christian view. However, I want to note that in the Jewish scriptures, there's a variety of understandings of what happens when a person dies, whether there is a resurrection or whether the soul continues in anything other than a shadowy state of existence, or even, in some texts, it seems, merely as a memory in future generations. But by the time the Christian scriptures were written, and we should remember that the authors of those texts were, with very few exceptions, also Jewish people, the view of a physical resurrection had become almost universally accepted. Yet in the Jewish scriptures, again, this is an idea that developed over time. I want to note, too, that in Christian teaching and in Jewish thought, this is applied at the level of the individual self. And this is distinct then, at least in some ways, as far as I can understand it, from the Gita, in which ultimately the individual self, the small a Atman, is the same in some way as the large S self. What about spirit and soul, as mentioned in the letter I cited? The consensus in Christian thinking might be best described by saying that there is an interconnection between soul and spirit, just as there is with the body, but that the spirit is what renders connection with the divine possible, while the soul is the seat of emotions and thought and will. If that distinction is accepted, then one can say that the soul is where consciousness is located, as it were, but that this is different than the human spirit. A text which is very suggestive here is another letter from Paul to a group in a different city, the city of Corinth, and in the 2nd chapter, the 11th verse, he wrote, "Who knows the thoughts of a person except for the person's spirit, which is in them?" Interestingly, that same verse describes the inner life of God in the same way. No one knows God's thoughts except God's spirit. So relative to human consciousness, the point seems to be that there is something else, something we might say is deeper than consciousness, the spirit, which has consciousness but is not equated with it. Nor, as we noted when I compared Jewish views with the Gita, is the individual self or spirit the same as the big S self. However, mysteriously, we might suggest that Paul at least says that this same dynamic is also true of the divine self, that there is a deeper self than even the divine consciousness or thoughts. Paul also went on to add in that same text that we somehow have not only our human spirit, but that divine spirit as well. And we'll have to come back to that later when we talk about the divine self. Let me turn to Islam, however. I'm going to organize the insights about consciousness that Islam contributes to the conversation around three main subtopics: the concept of the soul, types of consciousness, which will include consciousness of oneself and the divine, and then states of awareness or lack of awareness, including death and sleep. So first, the soul. The Arabic word nafs, related to that Hebrew word we noticed above, nephesh, refers to the soul. It's the essence of a person, the self. It's the seat of our deeper sense of identity and agency. It includes the capacity to perceive and to be aware of one's surroundings and actions, as well as the capacity for thought and understanding. It's the human nafs that enables us to understand our own character, feelings, motives, and desires. In other words, the soul of a human being is what enables consciousness, or we might say it's the instrument of consciousness, but seems to be other than just consciousness itself. Speaking of consciousness, what about types of consciousness, which is the second subtopic? In Islamic thought, especially in the Sufi traditions, there's emphasis on what I would call self-awareness or consciousness of oneself. This is not self-consciousness as we sometimes use it in English, meaning something like a sort of awkward embarrassment. But this way of using self-consciousness is referring to a deep, honest appraisal of one's nature and character, good and what we might call bad. But the emphasis on consciousness of the self is part of the process that aims at cultivating a state as well of divine consciousness, or what's called taqwa, sometimes translated as fear, but really rooted in simply being aware of the reality of the divine being. It involves conscious efforts as well to develop the habit of being mindful of the divine in this way. But then what about times when we're not mindful or aware or conscious? And that brings me to the third subtopic, aware and not aware. In an Islamic perspective, we can speak of the self as having two main states. There is the state of consciousness, which we've touched on above. It's the state that the soul or essence of who we are possesses. We can be aware, but awareness is not who we are. Let's think of it as being awake, being aware, alert, attentive. One reason I say all of this is because of the second state of the soul, which is what's called the state of death. But don't jump to the conclusion that it's just death as in the absence of life in our body. Muslim thinkers speak of death in its permanent state, as I just mentioned, but also temporary, meaning when we sleep. Relative to the current topic, the key point here is that Islamic thinking about human consciousness places it clearly on the side of the continental divide, the side that I've referred to as we are conscious or have consciousness. In very different ways, then, each religious heritage raises the question not only of our human nature, but especially of the relationship of the human self and human consciousness to the divine self and divine consciousness. Of course, no surprise that religious heritages would raise this. This episode isn't the place, and nor do I have the space here, to probe that question right now any further. I'm going to need to, and I will. There are real differences among the religions in terms of this question. Animism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Christianity and Islam all have a different take, and I will explore that. But first, a lingering question, and it brings me back to the Buddha. Notably missing from the list I just read off is Buddhism. I asked the question in the last episode and raised it again at the beginning of this one, whether Buddha belongs on the side of the divide where I placed him or not. I admitted as I started this episode that I'm still wrestling with that. Though mainstream Buddhism suggests that we are consciousness and nothing more, there are streams within Buddhism that suggest that consciousness is connected with something more, something permanent. So in Mahayana Buddhism, the concept of the Buddha nature or Buddha mind or luminous mind refers to something akin to a collective or universal consciousness of some sort, or even perhaps a divine consciousness, which can be shared along with the Buddha who attained it. However, it's important to add that even with this caveat, in Buddhist thinking, even if there is a self, which we can say has consciousness, or if there is a Buddha mind that has it, it's not an isolated individual self in the way that most of us use that term. It's more of a collective, shared thing. That's probably as far as I can go with it at this point. Now, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, in our wrestling with the religious questions and heritages on both sides of the divide, with physics and philosophy, it's clear that the question of whether there's something more than the something more keeps rising. And so in this episode, I've collected some insights from physics and philosophy and different religions, insights which see us as beings that are conscious and have consciousness, more than physical beings and more than the flow of awareness. There's a something in us that is more than that. But is there more than that also? And as I've said, this is approaching the point where I'm going to turn to look explicitly at the question of the divine self. And so as I come near to the end of this episode, I'm going to offer a poem that wrestles with the question of the human self, thought, consciousness, awareness, and brings in the divine self. It's a poem I called I and I. And for listeners who might not be reading the blog version of this, that's a big I and small I and I. I and I. I was going to say something, but a thought never formed, she said. We laughed, but I wondered, does this work the other way? I was going to think something, but a word never formed. And there it is, my question already a thought, formed in words. A man named Kurtubi said, using words of course, before the worlds, before time, before the angels, Allah praised himself. Did Allah speak to himself in words? Thoughts? John wrote in words about a word towards the God who was the Word that was towards the God who was, and so on. Was there actually a word? Thought. And then too there is Om. When I say it, it's a word. Some say it's the sound of the universe, embracing all other sounds within it. And what are words but thoughts, wrapped in sounds, wrapped again in the thoughts of someone hearing the sounds? There are thoughts that never find words, and there are thoughts before thoughts, thoughts without thought. Of course, to say so requires the thought that there may be no thoughts, and this has required words. There are times, I know, when I've spoken words for which I had no thoughts. What if I thought something for which I had no words? No one would know. Would I know? I cannot be alone in this, knowing something undefinable, inexplicable, yet patently, clearly known. Well then, what is it that you know when you know something you don't know? Fair question. And here's the rub. An answer requires words. Words require thoughts. What if there is no thought, and so no words for what I know? Then, here I am, in the impossible necessity of communicating, struggling to stitch and patch a cobbled something, like a child's stick-figure schoolroom picture of mommy, scratched in crayon on paper atop a glue-sticky desk, destined for a smile and a magnet and a refrigerator door. I think in the end, these scribbled words disguise more than they disclose. This is the way of things. There are things I know, you know, we know, rich, creamy, frothing with meaning. When we try to churn them down into yellow cubes of words, we find them melting away, butter in a heated pan. And of course, right there, to say that, I needed words, and you needed me to use them. I will intend, in moments at least, to just stop words, and to stop the thought of thinking. I seek some still, silent, unspoken knowing of whatever precedes words, thoughts, the knowing before knowing. Kurtubi, John, and the primordial hummers of Om will smile at me for this, patiently, indulging me, like the mommy taking and loving that child's crayoned smudges. Long ago, they seemed to have found a way to say that this wordless knowing is before anything else, before words and thoughts, the word of one speaking to oneself in praise and delight. I'm looking for that place. Place is a word for a thought about something surely meaningless here. The place where God's self is knowing God's self. God's I and I. A place where I and I to I and I to I, might exist, be, in a wordless, unknown knowing before knowing, somewhere in the depths of God. Well, what's next? I mentioned that we're approaching the point where I will turn to look explicitly at the question of a divine self. And I say in every opening of every episode of the podcast that I'm sharing how I, as an artist, view the world, humanity, and the divine. But I have not yet expressed my own conclusions about how I see humanity as an artist. And so I want to do that next time.